2004's The Batman had the unenviable task of being the first Batman cartoon to follow the seminal Batman the Animated Series. BTAS is still held in high regard to this day because of its thoughtful adaptation of villains, reimagining them as flawed, tragic figures lashing out at the world for wronging them. As successful as the show was with older audiences, executives always felt that it should be more appealing to younger audiences. This was the mandate given to the Batman. Tie in more with the toy lines, have more classic good versus evil storylines, and simplify the villains. Which they did for the most part, but there's one villain established in the first season that bucked this trend, and that's Ethan Bennett, the man who would become their first Clayface. One of the main things that sets him apart from other versions of Clayface is that Bennett was an established character, a detective in the Gotham City Police Department who, alongside his partner Ellen Yin, was tasked with apprehending Batman. He appeared in about half a dozen episodes before becoming Clayface, and of the two cops, he was the most supportive of Batman. He was also Bruce Wayne's best friend, and the pair were so close that Batman was considering revealing his secret identity to him. In researching this video, I found a number of wikis and forum posts loudly proclaiming that Ethan Bennett was a substitute for Harvey Dent, who filled a similar role in Batman the Animated Series. But I have yet to come across any official sources saying that. Yes, it has been widely discussed how Harvey Dent wasn't allowed to be used in the show because he was going to be very prominent in The Dark Knight. But that movie was released in 2008. Batman Begins didn't even come out until 2005, a year after The Batman started airing, and based on Batman and Robin's performance at the box office, there were no guarantees that there'd even be a second movie. Personally, I don't buy it. But I'm open to being proven wrong. Anyway, the point I was trying to get at is that sometimes, in their efforts to distinguish themselves from BTAS, the creative team behind The Batman would go down a completely different path with varying degrees of success. And I think it's safe to say that Ethan Bennett was a success. The thing with Clayface is that there have been almost a dozen of them in the comic books. The original Clayface was a murderer who wore a mask, while subsequent versions have mostly been shapeshifters. Since the early 2000s, pretty much any version of Clayface has resembled the one seen in Batman the Animated Series. They're all usually some sort of hulking brown monstrosity. But Ethan Bennett was different. His body resembled stoneware clay, which can be grey in colour, and he was shaped like a regular human being for the most part. And his descent wasn't really his fault. He had taken repeated verbal batterings from his boss, Chief Rojas, for his inability to capture Batman, and he wound up being kidnapped by Joker in the line of duty. Joker tortured Bennett to prove his belief that one rotten day is all it takes to break even the most decent person. This was a recurring thing with the Batman's Joker. He kept going back to the idea that his reaction to his rotten day, namely going insane, was perfectly normal, and that the same thing would have happened to anyone else. I've discussed this at length in an earlier video about Joker, which you should totally watch if you haven't seen yet. As ever, the link is in the info button and the video's description. This scene was clearly inspired by Alan Moore and Brian Bolland's seminal The Killing Joke comic, in which the Joker tried to break Commissioner Gordon by paralysing and degrading his daughter Barbara and psychologically torturing him at an abandoned fairground. While Gordon remained steadfast and held on to his sanity, Bennett was different because of his accidental exposure to the fumes from Joker's Joker Putty formula, a substance that could turn anything it touched into malleable putty. Joker had threatened to douse Bennett in the last of the formula, but Batman intervened, causing it to spill at Bennett's feet. Joker fled, which took everybody's attention, so no one really noticed that the tied-up Bennett had inhaled the fumes. And I think that's the key thing that separates this Clayface from the BTAS version. His creation was an accident. He was an unfortunate casualty in the Joker's antics. Once he was freed, Bennett declared that Batman had saved him, earning the ire of Chief Rojas, who suspended him. Later that evening, Bennett began to feel unwell and saw his face melt away in the mirror as he gasped in horror. Many viewers who watched as children have commented on how Bennett's face melting scene traumatized them. It's an image burnt into their minds. It was the combination of stress from his job, Joker's torture, and the Joker putty that led to Bennett becoming Clayface. You could say that Batman was indirectly responsible for his creation, given that his Batarang led to the Joker putty container breaking. But that's not really a path they took in the show. In Bennett's mind, it was all Joker's fault, but the reality is a bit more complex than that. Bennett initially sought help from nearby police officers, but they attacked him, seeing only a lumbering monster coming towards them. It was at this point he realised that he was on his own and decided to lash out at those he held responsible. Firstly, he went after Chief Rojas. In subsequent episodes, he attacked Joker. But at any point, he could have confided in his friends, either Yin or Bruce Wayne, and they would have helped him. But it was much easier for him to maintain the charade, probably more satisfying too. By establishing Bennett as a positive figure, the show made the audience care about him, and seeing his rapid descent into villainy doubtlessly broke the hearts of many viewers. Initially, all Bennett cared about was getting revenge, but eventually he decided to become a straight-up villain and started to commit robberies. One time he even impersonated Solomon Grundy. It's kind of funny that with these tremendous abilities, all he ever used them for was to help him steal things. I guess even clay monsters have bills to pay. I've previously made a whole video comparing the various animated versions of Clayface over the years. Go watch that if you haven't seen it already. So I don't want to linger too long on the differences between Beatas's Clayface and the Batman's Clayface, but for me, the Beatas Clayface is a far more interesting character. There's just a whole lot more to him. Everything about him is wrapped up in identity, victimhood, self-loathing, and disease. Every single one of his stories ends in tragedy. He's a very emotionally heavy character, rich with subtext, which says different things to different people. And I think that's great. Bennett, meanwhile, eventually gets a happy ending, and that may be preferable to some people. I've noticed that whenever I make a video about a villain, there's always a bunch of people saying that they wish they could see the villain reform and become a hero working alongside Batman, which, to me, sounds like one of the absolute worst things they could ever do. I'm glad that pretty much never happened in Beatas, but that's because I'm a deeply cynical person that responds to tragedy. So I can see why Bennett appeals to those people. While Bennett willingly gave up his chance at reforming in Meltdown, it was simply far easier to give in to his urges and be a thieving monster than put in the work to become a decent person. He changed his mind in the episode Clayfaces. Bennett had previously been told that if he stopped using his powers over time, they would gradually fade, almost to the point of not existing, but he just couldn't help himself. Like any addict, he was convinced that if he could just control his impulses, he would be the best version of himself. The problem was that the more he used his powers, the more the clay cells replicated, and they would take over. While Bennett initially rejected Wayne and Yin's help and decided to become a full-on villain, eventually he did change his mind. Bennett captured Joker, showed restraint, and turned himself in. When a new Clayface popped up, someone I'll talk more about in a future video no doubt, Bennett offered to help. While Bennett would have preferred to use his Clayface powers for good, everyone else could see that if he gave himself an inch, Clayface would take him for a mile. Batman was fully aware of his friend's flaw and developed an antidote that would completely remove Bennett's powers. He was fully prepared to force him to take it if needs be. This antidote would also be used on the new Clayface, but pinning him down was proving to be quite tricky. Enter Bennett, who accepted that the only way to stop the rampaging new Clayface was to allow himself to be injected with the cure as well. And that was the end of the first Clayface. Bennett was cured. While we didn't see Bennett again after this episode, in the episode Artifacts, which was set in the future, it was casually mentioned that Bennett had returned to the police and became the new chief of police. So he got his happy ending, but the show did absolutely nothing with him. I would have preferred it if Meltdown was Bennett's final appearance. At least then his story would end with some poignancy. As it was, what should have been a celebratory moment was just a damp squib. Especially when you consider that cure only temporarily removed Basil Karlo's powers, but again, I'll save that for the inevitable Clayface 2 video. In a lot of ways, I feel like Ethan Bennett is representative of the Batman as a whole. He was a significant character in the first season, but as the creative team moved on to other things and the network's feedback changed the direction of the show, he fell by the wayside. he was probably the most deep and meaningful character in the show. And over time, he was replaced by mostly hollow, generic, action-packed characters that wouldn't challenge the mindset of the audience or make them think about the way they live their lives. Even when they gave Bennett his happy ending, something that rarely happens in other Batman media, nothing was done with him. It's almost like they were just trying to get rid of him, and I think that's a real shame. Okay, that's it for this week's essay. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, tell all your friends about me. You know how YouTube works. If you really enjoyed the video and have the means, please consider making use of the thanks button to send a buck or two my way, because every little helps. I offer channel memberships for $1.99 a month. This will get you early access to my weekly video essay, priority responses to your comments, members-only videos, custom emojis, and an icon on your profile indicating that you're one of my people. And special thanks to my current channel members, who are all listed on the screen right now. Next time, I'll be back on Friday with a video about a relatively obscure Batman Beyond villain that represents the path our Batman of the future could have taken. We're going to be talking about Big Time. Then next Monday, well, you asked for more videos about Creature Commandos, so you're getting another one. I want to talk about Weasel, and how James Gunn took a ridiculous, obscure Firestorm villain and made me give a crap about him. Hope to see you then.